Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Gessel, and I'm the Director of Public Programs at Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco. MoAD is a contemporary art museum, and our exhibitions and programming inspire learning through the global lens of the African diaspora. As many of us are settlers, immigrants, or descendants of those forcefully brought to this continent, our institutions were founded upon exclusions and erasures of the indigenous peoples on whose land we are located. With deep respect, MoAD acknowledges that even in virtual space, we reside on unceded native lands and thank the Ramaytush and Chochenyo Ohlone peoples of the Bay Area who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. You can learn more about the native lands you occupy at nativeland.ca, and I can put that link in the chat. I welcome you to the program series African Diaspora Film Club, occurring monthly with Cornelius Moore, who is co-director of California Newsreel, the 53-year-old social issue nonprofit film distribution and production company. He is also an independent film curator specializing in works from and about the Black world. I want to thank Black Public Media for co-sponsoring this series and the Ethnicity, Race, and Indigenous Peoples section of the Latin American Studies Association for co-presenting today's program. Today, we will discuss the diaspora in Latin America through 3 short films made by Dr. Sheila S. Walker. If you haven't had a chance to watch the films, I'll put the links to them in the chat today as well. Sheila S. Walker is a cultural anthropologist, writer, and documentary filmmaker. She was a professor of anthropology and directed the Center for African and African American Studies at the University of Texas at Austin and the African Diaspora and the World Program at Spelman College. She is the principal of Afro Diaspora Global that creates and shares with the public information about the global African diaspora. She's done fieldwork, lectured, consulted, and participated in and organized cultural events in most of Africa and its diaspora. We'll start today's discussion with Cornelius and Dr. Walker, and we encourage everyone to participate by making comments and sharing your reactions in the chat and submitting questions through the Q&A box. And finally, please take a moment to type where you're joining us from in the chat. We love finding the diaspora in our audience. I'll turn it over to you now, Cornelius.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. And greetings, Sheila. First, I want to say how honored I am to be talking to you and all the work that you've done over the years. And I think we're going to have a thrilling conversation.
I think so, too.
So we'll want to get to the films, of course, but I want to begin with you asking how you began on this journey. And I know some of it began in that very well-known site of the African diaspora in New Jersey. But yes, but yeah, you could just share with us how you started this work.
Well, somehow I knew that Jersey wasn't the whole world. And one real way I knew was that I was lucky. I had an aunt, my grandmother's sister, who lived in Chinatown, not because she was Chinese, of course, because my grandmother wasn't Chinese, but because, you know, African Americans could live in communities of other peoples of color. So she lived in Chinatown, which was wonderful. When my parents would take me to visit my aunt, she didn't have kids, she didn't have a television. So I would look out of the window at the Chinese people, and it was beautiful, colorful. I was learning how to read and write. You know, I was about 4 when my memories began. And I would look for, you know, there's all this writing in Chinatown. And so I looked for the words I knew, the letters I knew, and they weren't there. That was confusing. And people spoke something I didn't understand. I didn't know there were other languages. So Chinatown was where I began to become an anthropologist and to want to get to know my neighbors on the planet. And where are they? How do you get to where they are? How do they live? What do they eat? I was curious. Of course, I didn't get to go anyplace until I went to college. But once I went to college.
Yeah, okay. And where'd you go?
I went to Bryn Mawr College.
Oh, I didn't know that. I grew up in Chester, Pennsylvania, so okay, not far from there.
That's part of my story. I was the last only colored girl in a class at Bryn Mawr, and it was fine. I had a point of reference. It was different from Bryn Mawr, obviously. You know,
Mhm.
at East Orange High School, we never sang Greek hymns to the sun in Greek. We never did that. But Bryn Mawr had a junior abroad program. I wanted to go someplace, any place. Well, any place at that point meant France.
Mhm.
High culture, right?
Uh,
But right before going to France, I learned about the Experiment in International Living and that it had a program in Cameroon. So I went to Cameroon for a summer and that was it. That's how I became an anthropologist. I thought I wanted to be a US diplomat, and then I met some US diplomats and I thought, not like that. Now, the US diplomatic corps has gotten a lot better, but
mhm.
I asked one of these guys who'd only been in Cameroon for 2 years what he thought of Cameroonian food, and he thought he may have had some.
Okay.
Thought he may have had some. Cameroon has a very rich and diverse culinary panoply of traditions.
Mhm.
And what he'd had was some grilled beef.
Oh, that's very French, right? So,
Yeah. But it's probably, I mean, it's probably what, street food, right?
okay. Mm.
But he probably had his cook prepare it in his fancy US style dining room with no spice.
Mhm.
So that's how I became an anthropologist. Those guys really helped me.
Okay. And so so with the experience in Cameroon, then I'm curious how you went from there to the kind of well, the adventurous work that you've done outside of the outside of the continent, and what it was like for you in academia when you're doing this kind of work that you were doing. I mean, were you getting curiosity? Were you support? Were you getting encouragement from your professors?
The answer is very simple.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
When I was at
Okay.
Bryn Mawr, I was the colored girl. There were no courses that had anything to do with me. And Chester, Pennsylvania, as the only colored girl, things happened that were kind of interesting that I didn't understand then. But the head of physical education invited me to be on the swimming team. I had never been on a swimming team and I hadn't tried out, but I became the touch of color and we swam against teams around the area, including in Chester.
Oh
And
wow.
my 2 years of swimming, I never saw another touch of color. So I didn't learn anything about me at Bryn Mawr at all. But after being in Cameroon for the summer, and it was in Cameroon that I learned about the existence of the African diaspora, because my Cameroonian family that was very Pan-Africanist. This was shortly after independence. My Cameroonian father was like the lieutenant governor of the region in which he lived. This is the Bamoun Kingdom. And that Tarzan was the image of Africa at that point. This one lone white man swinging through trees, talking to animals, and being smarter than all the natives. Well, I was in the capital of a kingdom. The father of the king, when I was there, had built a palace that's been restored by UNESCO. He had created a writing system for his language in which he wrote books. So that wasn't what I was set up for. And my Cameroonian family would ask me, well, do you know Sparrow from Trinidad? No, I'm from Jersey. Why would I know somebody from the Caribbean? Do you know Pele from Brazil? Well, no. Everybody else may have known about Pele, but we in Jersey didn't know about him. So I learned about the African diaspora. When we had parties, the music was from Cuba, from Guadeloupe, from Ghana, High Life. It wasn't, the Tarzan image of African music. Their outfits were not the Tarzan image of African.
Okay.
These folks were so elegant. I was raggedy. But then I went to France. There were courses on Africa, anthropology courses. So, I was really introduced. I go back to Bryn Mawr. I negotiate switching from political science to anthropology. The professors were fine with that. Then I go to grad school in anthropology, and then it all kind of falls apart because I think that anthropologists are supposed to be interested in other people's cultures and appreciative of other people's cultures, including mine. Well, wrong. The professors, by definition, white males, told me I had no culture. We African Americans had no culture. There are famous sociologists, Gunnar Myrdal, who was brought from Sweden by the Carnegie Corporation to study the Negro problem. David Patrick Moynihan, who became a New York senator, wrote in his Beyond the Melting Pot that we African Americans were the only ethnic group in the United States with no culture. And Myrdal, he was even worse. He said, if we had any culture, it was pathological. So obviously, my professors who were trying to teach me that kind of worldview and I were not in agreement, and they were very unsupportive of my desire to do research on people of African origin. When I said I wanted to do research in Africa, or the African diaspora, my dissertation advisor said that I would have no advantage over him in doing such research, ignoring the fact that I looked like, had a similar history to the folks I was talking about, and he looked like the colonizers. I guess he didn't notice that. But so I was determined about what I wanted to study, and I did. And I studied it the way I wanted to study it. But I couldn't do everything I wanted until I got out of graduate school and was therefore free to get an education.
So it sounds like it was a battle.
Yeah. And then I taught at the University of California at Berkeley, and I was hired specifically to introduce cultural perspectives about educational issues. And when it came time for tenure, my good colleagues who seemed to like what I was doing said no. And I said, what do you mean no? You all invited me here. I probably will leave at some point, but when I want to, as I want to. And I did. I was invited to teach at William and Mary, and then University of Texas, and then Spelman. Finally got to an HBCU. So but in all of it, my issue was I want to know what they're not teaching me. I want to know about the globality of the African diaspora. And I got that in Fumban in Cameroon. So that's where it all started.
So I actually think that's when I met you first physically, because at Berkeley, because California Newsreel, there were some folks from the newly created Film Institute in Mozambique.
Right.
And we were showing their films, and you spoke Portuguese, and nobody else in the group did, so we needed you to do some translation there.
Yes, and I just got an email today. I sent him information about our getting together today to Pedro Pimenta, and you showed MoAD. MoAD. That was a long time ago.
That was a while ago, yeah. So, and another sort of thing I want to, and that's when we met physically, but I remember reading things that you wrote in, I think it was the Black Collegian, and things were not scholarly journals. So,
yes,
in which I wasn't reading scholarly journals anyway, but I want to hear you talk about why you decided to do that and what kind of reaction you got from academia.
Well, I thought, anthropology seemed to be such a great discipline. I didn't yet know that it had been characterized as a child of imperialism and handmaiden of colonization, right? I didn't know that, fortunately, or I might not have been one. So I thought you were supposed to get to know people and appreciate them and share the information with others. So when I came back from Africa, particularly African Americans had a lot of questions about my life in Africa. And so I thought, well, let me write. And it was the 70s. And we African Americans were getting more means of communication. I met somebody at Essence magazine who said, you're a what? An anthropologist? Why don't you write an article about that? So I did. It's called Anthropology, What's That? And that led me to write more articles for Essence about different elements of African American culture from my perspective as an anthropologist. Well, the reaction from my colleagues, first my professors, then my colleagues, was, why are you popularizing? I didn't know that popularizing was a sin in academia. I thought I was supposed to write for these magazines that had thousands of readers, as opposed to only academic journals who had 10, I got responses from my popular articles. I met a young woman who said, oh, I read your article about Bahia. I had to go there. I learned Portuguese. I studied there. Thank you. I got all articles about, I wrote about my family tree. I wrote about all kinds of things. And I always got responses. I didn't get responses like, well, you didn't cite the, the theory. No, people liked it. I wrote an article about my principal socializer being my father. I got articles from other women who said, yeah, I was a daddy's girl too. Glad you told our story.
Okay. So maybe we'll hear later about that you're writing your memoir, because I'm so fascinated by all the things you're talking about, the things you wrote, and that I want to read them. So hopefully we'll see that in printed form sometime.
Yeah, you know, actually on my website, some of my articles are clickable,
Okay.
so you can read them. And I am writing a memoir. I don't know if it's a memoir anymore or something that is presented in a memoir style, but about more thematic issues like relations between Africans and African Americans, the role of Africans in the creation of the modern world, something I was not told about until I organized a conference myself in 1996. And I learned from other colleagues so much that I thought I should have learned before. And one element I think is really important is the demographics of the creation of the Americas. So we know that there were indigenous people all over the Americas until Columbus arrived with germs. And so the first warfare was bacteriological. That a lot of the European illnesses killed Native Americans who had no experience of them and therefore no resistance. Then, you know, then there was the mistreatment, and the bringing of Africans to do the work of creating the new societies of the Americas, because the indigenous people weren't there and were therefore not available to do the forced labor of creating the Americas. So that's, you know, I just learned some really basic stuff. And I tried to put all of that on this website that I'm loving. I thought it was just going to be small, but the web designer said, oh, this has got to be a source of information. And so it is.
Well, right now we'll mention it and we'll mention it again, but what's the address of the website?
It is.
Oh, it's up. Yeah, it's Afro Diaspora. Well, no, you say it.
Yeah, AfroDiasporaGlobal.com, you know, with the HTTPS.
Okay.
Blah, 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 but Afro Diaspora Global. So that's
great. Yeah, Elizabeth just put it in the chat.
Okay, yeah, we don't always know that it's global. So that's important to insist that it's global.
So when did you start doing visual research and taking pictures and doing films in your work?
It all started with my father. I told you I'm daddy's girl, right? So whenever I go someplace, when I came back, he'd say, you bring any pictures? So once I got a decent camera and started making slides, when I came back from wherever, he would invite friends over and I would show my slides of wherever I had been. And it was great because, you know, these are regular folks from Jersey who had all these questions about all these places I went. And some of them inspired me, for example, to shift my focus. One man said, are there any cities in those places where you go? And I said, yeah, of course there's cities. He said, well, why don't you show us cities? And I said, well, you know what a city looks like. And then I thought, no, he doesn't. He hasn't seen Paramaribo in Suriname. And Paramaribo doesn't look like Douala in Cameroon. And neither one of them looks like Newark, New Jersey. So he made me understand that I needed to show a range of lifestyles, you know, fancy modern houses, as well as traditional houses, the same person dressed in traditional clothes and Western clothes, movie theaters, recording studios, to give him and others a sense of, oh, okay, this is Africa. Fancy banks, you know, modern architecture. That was important. And then someone said, well, you need a camera, you know, because where you go, things are moving, right? Yeah. So I bought a camera on the way to a festival in Brazil, and 1997. And that camera turned out to be so useful because it had the little window so that you could see what was being filmed. And I went to a religious ceremony, an Afro-Brazilian religious ceremony that lasted for several days in Brazil, in Codó, in the state of Maranhão. And once the priest, the Afro-Brazilian priest, understood that he could see himself in that, I became indispensable. Nothing could happen without me because he wanted me to film him and his ceremony. So I got it, you know, that helped me, made me understand the importance of, one, filming from the inside out, because I wasn't trying to sneak, you know, images of him. No, he wanted to see himself, and I sent him all the stuff. So that was the beginning. That I felt that I had a responsibility to portray people and to share their portrayals. And I went to India, to Karnataka, and I filmed people. And then after, and I put them in my most recent film, Familiar Faces, Unexpected Places, a Global African Diaspora. And then I thought, oh, I wonder if they wanted me to do that. And I sent them a copy, and the response was, thank you for letting the world know that we exist. Wow.
Well, I think it also points to who you are and how you relate to people, because the story is that, well, from other academics or anthropologists, that, oh, people don't want us to take their picture, it takes their soul, and they resist, you know, all those things.
Yeah.
And you're saying something really different.
Absolutely. And my experience has been really different. Initially, I had a Polaroid camera. And so I would take folks pictures in Northern Cameroon, for example. And then it was great to watch them look at this blank piece of paper I gave them and think, we didn't think she was going to trick us, but she deceived us. And then as the image came, they were like, oh. And they started calling it photo magique, magic photo, and everybody wanted one. So I had two cameras, right? One for them, one for me. Everybody was happy. So that, you know, people don't want you to steal their images, but when they know why you want to take their images and show them to other people, that it's your goal to say, oh, African's not Tarzan. You know, let me show you these sophisticated people in traditional and modern ways. I understand that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's logical, but going back is there's arguments about why they, you know, some people couldn't do it and what the resistance, and there was resistance was certainly legitimate.
Yeah,
so
yeah. And when you see the kinds of images that people portray of Africans, for example, I mean, even now, right? So Africans used to be primitive, okay? Now, what? Ebola, you know, strange diseases, wars. Well, I've been in a lot of Africa. I haven't been any place where there was a strange disease or a war. I was going to Cameroon back when it was Ebola in places like Texas. And a friend said, hey, don't bring us Ebola because we don't have it here. You have it in the United States, but don't bring it here, okay?
Okay. So Scattered Africa, that was, I mean, you made that to document the conference that you did, right?
Yeah.
So tell us, and this is in my queue also to bring up the copy of a book that came from the from the conference.
Yes. Yeah. Raise it a bit so they can see the title. Okay. African Roots, American Cultures, Africa and the Creation of the Americas. Yeah, when I was at the University of Texas, I directed the Center for African and African American Studies, and I organized a conference on the African diaspora and the modern world. And I really didn't know all that I was going to get out of it, but it was about the protagonism of Africans and African diasporans in the creation of the modern world. So when I called someone in South America and invited him, he said, oh, I'll talk about racism. And I said, no, you won't. It's not about what somebody did to us. It's what we have been doing. Well, okay, he managed to talk very competently about African descendants in Latin America and their contributions to their nations and the organizations that Afro-South Americans had created. I invited another Afro-descendant from the same country who said, oh, I'd love to come to speak at your conference, but I didn't have the privilege of attending a university. How can I talk at a university? I said, well, you have two choices. You can come and talk yourself about your own community, or you can give me the name of the anthropologist, historian, to whom you told your story, who's got some, fancy university job, and who would love to come and tell your story. He came, he told his story. And he told it very well because it's his story. He knows it. And so all the people I invited 60 people or so from 20 countries in Africa, the Americas, the Caribbean. And once again, I sinned. I already sinned by popularizing information, in essence, Ebony emerge. I sinned again. I invited people who were not academics because it's hard to find. It was hard to find. This was 1996. Afro-South Americans who had the privilege of attending a university, the privilege of being a researcher. So I invited people who were perfectly literate about their own societies. They hadn't been taught a lot, but nor have we been taught a lot. They were perfectly able to present their own societies in their own ways and talk about their contributions to the nations they lived in. And and folks in the United States, anthropologists, university professor said, where did you find those people? She's from where? Argentina? There are Black people in Argentina? Oh, did you see her? She's not, is she or isn't she? She is. And on the website, I have a whole page about the conference, and it has interviews from people who were there because I had, unusually, we filmed much of the conference, filmed interviews with people, and some of the clips are in Scattered Africa, Faces and Voices of the African Diaspora, but they're just clips. And if you listen to the whole interview, wow, there was so much more said than could be said in the clips. So I was just tormented by the fact that I had all these Betacam tapes neatly arranged in the closet. How useless. I couldn't watch them. I don't have a Betacam deck. Who does? So I found somebody who did, who digitized them. And so now my page on my website has the story of the conference, interviews with all those folks who exist or don't exist, but seem to exist. And so that was the beginning of my really understanding the virtue of sharing the African diaspora with the African diaspora and with other people who may not know they're part of the African diaspora. When I give talks about the diaspora, often I begin with, who's of African origin here? And you see people with a lot of melanin who raise their hands, and you see people with very little melanin who raise their hands because they know the story. And so I then say, okay, thank you, all of you. And you who are not of African origin, what planet are you from? Mars, Venus, Jupiter? Because what we know now is that human beings, modern human beings like us, all came from Africa. We know it from paleontologists, we know it from linguists, we know it from geneticists. So I think we know that by now. But that gave me the desire to film more. Every place I go, I take my little camera and to share those images with people because I love the feedback that I get, great feedback. Some of it is, oh, I had no idea that there were Black folks in those places. What, Argentina, Chile, huh? How'd they get there? Well, how did we get here?
Is there a particular fascination for you or interest of people of African descent in the Americas?
I was interested in all of us in all of the Americas initially, but now that's not enough. I know we're all over it. And all the societies of the Americas from Chile to Canada have organized African diaspora groups. Many have several. Chile, one of the places that Encyclopedia Britannica said there are no Black folks in Chile. Well, there are, and they are so organized. And they have done so much the last 20 years or so to promote their culture, to make themselves aware of it, and to get recognized as existing as an ethnic group by their government that had denied that they existed, like other folks in the Southern Cone. They've all been trying to get recognized and to show the world that, yeah, they're here too.
Is there anything from the conference in the book of updates of the people who attended and were doing their work that you want to share with us? Probably a lot.
Well, from what I realized when I had the Betacam tape digitized was that so much of what people said in 1996 is absolutely revolutionary today, and most people don't know it. one element of datum that I found surprising and really, well, essential to know the Americas, it is that before 1800, of 6.5 million people who came to the Americas across the Atlantic Ocean from Africa and Europe, 5.5 million people came from Africa. 1 million people came from Europe. So we're given the impression, we are specifically taught, that the Americas are a European creation, a European imposition perhaps, but during more than 300 years, almost everybody in the Americas, after the genocide of the indigenous people, almost everybody in the Americas was African or African descendant. So how are we going to pretend that the bases of these societies were created by Europeans who were not even here? That's crucial, you know, and it's interesting that, you know, I was never taught that in all my studies to get a PhD from the University of Chicago, presumably one of the best universities in the nation. But they didn't bother teaching me about us. And when I was there, when we graduate students organized the Black Student Association, we, of course, just like other African-American students around the country, wanted courses about our realities. And the first course I had to drop out because I asked the teacher some questions and his answers were wrong. Now that's inexcusable. And it was clear that I was wasting my time in it.
Well, since we're in the, well, we're still in the UN designated decade of the African diaspora, and I keep hearing that, and I kind of look like what's happened during this decade. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, and maybe reflect on the relationship between that and familiar faces and unexpected places, your film.
Yeah, well, the decade. I was looking forward to the decade, and I knew an Afro-Colombian who was on a UN part of a UN agency that was trying to promote that decade. So on one occasion, he said, well, why don't you just come to New York and help me go talk to people about the importance of the decade? I was there. And so we went to see the leader of the Africa group, who said, I understand, and we will support you. We saw the leader of the Europe group, and he said, yeah, seems that this should happen. And so our decade is started in 2015, ends in 2024, and it is still shocking in the United States that so few people have ever heard of the decade. Elsewhere in the Americas, in some places, there has been programming by, for example, ministries of culture in the context of the decade. My experience has been that the country that's done the most has been Colombia. Curiously enough, that's been my experience. Now I'm, probably missing places. I'm sure some stuff has been done in Brazil, for example, but not much. And here we are now, kind of wringing our hands. What, we only have how many years? Very few years left. And the United States, although the United Nations headquarters is physically in New York, it's hard to get information out of the across First Avenue, from the United Nations compound into Manhattan. So this information is very little known. I was invited, and I love this, to give a keynote at the United Nations in 2016 for the commemoration of the transatlantic slave trade and the victims of slavery. And I tend not to talk about slaves because I think that's a pretty retrograde term to call somebody a slave. It suggests that the person has no agency. It ignores all of the intellectual importance that Africans brought to the Americas. We see Africans coming to the Americas involuntarily as enslaved people, not slaves, enslaved. It was a condition, it wasn't the totality of that person. We're given the impression that these Africans who were brought by Europeans who already knew which Africans knew what, okay? So there was nothing random about slavery. The Europeans knew who cultivated rice, who mined gold. So they, for example, in Ouro Preto in Brazil, the center of the Brazilian gold rush, it was said that having people that the Europeans then enslavers called negros minas, mining Negroes. Well, when the Portuguese found the gold of the indigenous people, whom they had pretty much eliminated by then, when they found that gold, they didn't know how to mine it. If they did, they would have stayed home. They came to the Americas looking for El Dorado, right? Gold. So they said, and I love this sentence, that the presence of negros minas and gold mines brought an almost magical luck for finding gold. Luck? These folks were brought because of their metallurgical expertise. Rice, the rice that we call Carolina rice should be called West African rice, Senegambian rice, Malian rice, in that the first rice brought to the United States and other places in the Americas, Brazil, Suriname, Jamaica, came from West Africa. Enslavers would ask specifically for rice Negroes. And a lot of those rice Negroes were women. Men prepared the land, women owned the seeds, planted, harvested, did all that kind of complex processing of rice. So we need to re-look at the enslavement of Africans in the Americas, not as an unskilled labor migration, but on the contrary, as a skilled labor migration. Who did the work? Africans, 300 years.
I also thought it was fascinating you referred to Colombia as doing a lot of the development of the work in the international decade, and I know there's a lot of resistance and organizing in Colombia, and you present that in Drumming for Our Rights, and and people using culture for rights.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, two things. One, I never addressed adequately the decade. So the decade's themes, and then I'll get to Colombia.
Okay.
It's all part of the same thing.
Okay.
The decade's themes are recognition, justice, and development. And what I have found is that when there are activities, they tend to be about justice or injustice. And obviously we need more justice, but just talking about justice does not change the paradigm. It doesn't change the narrative. It doesn't recognize the roles of Africans and African diasporans in creating the Americas. It maintains the hierarchy of some people get more justice than others and can vote to give more justice to other people, but it doesn't change anything. Whereas recognition, first of all, it's got to be self-recognition. We need to learn our own stories and know that there are people who don't want us to know our own stories. But we need to know them. Marcus Garvey, preceding Bob Marley, said, well, Bob Marley said, we probably know this better. Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. That's in Redemption Songs. Garvey had said, emancipate yourself from mental slavery. Others can free your body. None but ourselves can free our minds. And Peter Tosh in Poor Slave said, they took the shackles off your body and put the shackles in your mind. So we need to emancipate ourselves. During this keynote I did at the UN in 2016, I kind of criticized the some of the content of what the UN said we should do in terms of the decade, like talk about the real history of Africans in the Americas, the real history of African descendants, talking about all the tragedies and the horrors. Well, I had shown another film that I made with some with Georges Collinet from Afropop Worldwide, to some kids, secondary school kids in Brooklyn. And Brooklyn being the epicenter of Africa and the African diaspora. I figured these kids were from every place. I don't know where, but every place. And one kid said, it seems that our teachers didn't teach us everything. They left out some of the story. I said, oh, what did they leave out? They left out, for example, that Africans were rulers in India over Indians. Why didn't they tell us that? Why didn't they tell us the good parts? Why did they only tell us the parts that would make us ashamed and not want to recognize our story? So with those Brooklyn adolescents in my head, after doing this keynote at the UN, which I did talk about the Brooklyn adolescents and said, look, we don't want to just talk about the tragedies. We want to talk about the triumphs in spite of all the contributions that Africans and African descendants have made and continue to make, particularly to the Atlantic world. So for the decade, I'm bothered. Recognition is not being addressed. So I went to the person who was in charge of the Decade at the time. I think she was Swiss, and said, so what's your program for Black History Month? So I have a film you could show. You want to see this film? Yes. So they were thrilled to get to show Familiar Faces, Unexpected Places, a global African diaspora that became the Black History Month program at the United Nations for the Decade for People of African Descent in 2018. And the Remember Slavery program, terrible name, but they sent the documentary around the world to UN information centers in the Americas, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, and Europe, so that they could see the film. And I got some feedback, not enough, of course, but some, but it still exists. And I need to get it out more in the world because I get great responses. I showed both Scattered Africa and Familiar Faces to a group of US African Americans of the non-international kind. And so some of their questions were, so speaking to their non-internationality, wow, I didn't know all those people were out there. Wow, wow. But one woman said, I have to tell you, I'm not the same person I was when I walked into this room. After seeing your films, I've been transformed. I feel like I've been baptized. Ooh, perfect. That those people you showed us, I used to see them as foreigners, as immigrants, as others. Now I see them as us. So, and so, going to Columbia, going to La Boquilla, usually I was a Fulbright professor, and usually the Fulbright professors are in the capital teaching the elite, helping them improve their English. Well, I was in a community, an Afro-Colombian community, and it was nice. And I was working with musicians and helping to give them a sense of the diaspora. They got it. They really got it. And so their music has gotten more conscious, more diasporic, and they talk about using their increased knowledge of their culture to gain more rights, to organize their community, for example. The community where I was, La Boquilla, it's in a beautiful place right on the Caribbean coast now. And here are these Afro Colombians on this great beach. Part of that beach, there's a wall. I called it the Berlin Wall because it separates the community from the hotels, the fancy hotels. And the fancy hotels want to gobble up the rest of that beach, of course. Well, they're, I think in the end of the last century, Colombia created a law, I think it's 70, that gave collective land rights to some Afro-Colombian communities. And this one has collective land rights. Well, of course, there are all these efforts to undermine their collective land rights. But as a result of organizing around their culture, using the drums to organize, they have gotten backing from a group of Afro-Colombian lawyers who are specifically fighting the efforts to deprive these communities of their collective land rights, because only those collective land rights are protecting them. And now Colombia is being really amazing. I mean, Colombia's done some interesting things, or some interesting things have happened in Colombia. A vice presidential candidate, Francia Marquez, who has not had it easy and who does not have it easy and is constantly threatened.
Oh yes, death threats constantly, yes.
Constant death threats. And there's the model of Mirelle Franco in Rio, who was a Black woman on the city council. Well, she was murdered in the street, and it's still one of those unsolved murders. And Afro-Colombian leaders are always getting death threats. I mean, they become uncountable, and they come in different ways. They get phone calls, they get emails, they get texts, they get all kinds of things, and they are not adequately protected. And she's probably the most exposed person at this point.
Oh, most definitely. And I'm glad you mentioned that her campaign and the Washington office in Latin America covers a lot of what's going on in Colombia. And And as actually there was today, I think in the New York Times, there's an article about Francia Marquez.
Yeah, but she says, if we don't speak up, they'll kill us. If we speak up, they'll kill us. So we might as well speak up. And
I know there are a lot of questions. I have one more before I want to take some of the questions. Was the relationship of your work to religion? And I was always fascinated because what we know about, if people know anything about Afro diaspora religions in Latin America, they know Santeria in Cuba or Candomblé in Brazil, that they come from the Yoruba culture or Voodoo in Haiti, same kind of area. But you are finding the connection with Congo and Congolese culture. So please say more about that.
Okay, well, I discovered, from Jersey, East Orange is where I grew up most of the time. And, but I discovered in my article, in that book you showed, I have an article called Everyday Africa in New Jersey. And so there were all these elements of Africanity that were part of my daily life, but I didn't know that they were of African origin. I mean, I didn't know why my father called his friends cats until I learned some Wolof and found that a cat in Wolof kat means someone who does something. And there are hip cats, hippie cat, hippie to have your eyes wide open to know what's going on, to be a hippie cat, a hip cat. Now, my father certainly had no idea that was Wolof. Wow, we say that all the time, right? I guess
Wow.
a Queen's English, but it's Wolof. And I learned very little Wolof, but just enough to become curious to know a little more. Like, okay, cat, got it. Well, why are women chicks? And Wolof jeg? Why are we used to call the police the fuzz? Why? Mounted police on horses, crowd control. I remember those horses. Fas in Wolof, horse. So without knowing our African origins, there's so much about ourselves that we don't understand. So I went to a Baptist church in Newark, New Jersey on a Sunday. First time I went to the adult church and saw those ladies with the hats and the purses start jumping around and getting happy, receiving the spirit. I thought that was fascinating. It was something different. So I wanted to know, who's the spirit? Where's spirit come from? What's spirit's name? There's no answer to all that within Christianity. When I went to my first candomblé ceremony in Bahia, I got it. I saw the body language. I felt when the drums got hot, okay, no drums in the Baptist church, but they got organs, they got pianos, they have feet, you can make rhythm. So I got it. I understood that, in the Yoruba tradition that came to Bahia, the spirit has names. Okay, there is Shango, there's Yemanja, there's lots of them. But then, so I thought, oh yes, all Yoruba. Wrong. Because first of all, most of the Africans who came to the Americas were not Yoruba. Most of the Africans, over 12 million people who came to the Americas involuntarily over almost 400 years, most of them came from Central Africa. Why? Well, a lot of human density is there. That was where the Portuguese were kidnapping people, especially. And so it was this Central African spirituality that was the basis of the spirituality of African descendants throughout the Americas prior to the arrival of the Yoruba in certain places. Yoruba didn't go every place. So they're very important in Bahia. They're very important in Cuba. They're important in Haiti. But within Yoruba religion, there's a lot that's not Yoruba, that's really from Central Africa. And at this point, it's, and in Bahia, for example, there's Candomblé Ketu. Okay, Ketu is a Yoruba town in Benin. There's Candomblé Angola also. So that focuses more on the Nkisi, spiritual beings from Central Africa. And if you leave Bahia, if you go, for example, to Minas Gerais, there is Yoruba spirituality, true. But that's not all there is. And the major African manifestation in the state of Minas Gerais, also in other states like São Paulo, is from Central Africa, Congada. Congada. And it's different. It's more connected to Catholicism because the Portuguese began to Catholicize the Kingdom of Congo at the beginning of the 1500s. So, but what kind of Catholicism is this? This is a very African form of Catholicism. If you go to a Congada, you don't look at it and say, oh, that looks very Catholic. No, you see the image of Our Lady of the Rosary, and then you listen to the rhythm and you think, that rhythm is from Africa. You see the body language. And then you find out more about the beliefs, and that's not European. Africa is so permeates Brazil in the Americas, but it's all over the place. In Chile, for example, in northern Chile, where the Afro-Chileans are concentrated, there was a neighborhood called Lumbanga. Nah, that doesn't sound Spanish to me. Foods, mondongo. We call it, well, we call it tripe, but it's like chitlins.
Chitlins, right.
Yeah. Mondongo is eaten from, I have eaten mondongo from Buenos Aires to Veracruz in Mexico. It's also called menudo in Mexico. It's called other things in other places. And then you ask folks, well, where does mondongo come from? Oh, it's pure Castilian. I don't think so. You know, that word sounds so much more like the kingdom of Ndongo in Angola. Now, I'm not saying that Spaniards don't eat tripe. What I'm saying is they don't call it mondongo. They have a festival in Madrid, Callos a la Madrileña. Callos, that's what they call it in Spanish. They don't call it mondongo. So we just need to be able to see, you know, we need a new lens that allows us to see the Africanity of so much of what we do. And if we don't understand that, we don't understand why we're doing it.
Thank you. I want to get to some of these questions while we have time. Let's see. And there are quite a few. Let's see.
Good. You know, I love to talk about this. It's easy for me to just go on and on and on. So I'm going to love all the questions.
Okay. I saw, and I may need help here because there's the, oh wait, here. Dr. Walker, do you feel you are chronicling the development of the awareness of the diaspora to themselves? Thank you for your awareness. And when are you going to have to do another conference?
Yeah, I'd love to do another conference so I can learn some more. I don't know, but you check out my website. If I'm going to do one, I'll tell you. And yes, I do feel that I am, as a result of the privilege I have of being able to go and visit the diaspora in so many places, I am helping people to understand the African diaspora. Yeah, because, you know, we have been taught to be ignorant about our own stories. And unless we have the opportunity to go and see where we are in other places, what we're doing, how are we going to know? Now there are more and more books, and there are more and more good books. I'm reading a book right now that is wonderful. It's called Born in Blackness by Howard French, and it's about changing the story of the Atlantic world, acknowledging Africa and Africa's importance in the Atlantic world, Europe, the Americas. It's wonderful, and it's so researched, so well researched. It's amazing how he could have done so much. And it's really, you know, swimming against the current because we're being told the contrary, but there's so much data that proves the other. And we're also given the impression that we are so different from each other. And particularly when there are language barriers. But, you know, first of all, we Anglophones, right? We are the worst. We think everybody else ought to speak English, but if we learn some of those languages too, we can learn a lot. And what I have found fascinating is that we, diasporically speaking, ebonically speaking, we have some of the same concepts, you know? I mean, one of the issues that we know about in the United States is hair, right? We have good hair and we have bad hair. Now, I'm lucky. When I grew up, we only had one friend who had bad hair. That's because he didn't have any hair. But other than that, I didn't know the people had good hair, bad hair. People had hair or they didn't. But if you check out the other languages, the other colonial languages that African descendants speak,
Yes.
pelo malo.
Pelo malo. Yes.
Pelo ruim.
Yeah, right. Yeah. There's even a movie from Venezuela called Pelo Malo.
Yeah, she's just solve. That means having good hair and Caribbean Creole.
So there's another question about why is Uruguay losing its Black population?
Well, I didn't know that Uruguay was losing its Black population, but I can come up with some reasons. I have known Uruguayans whom I've met in Argentina. So I guess they find that they have more opportunities in Argentina, economic opportunities. Now, I can't say Argentina is the paradise for Black folks. I don't think it's ever been. And Argentina is a wonderful country in its denial of its Blackness. Argentina, I mean, the president of Argentina. I was at the UN and the Argentinian ambassador told me with such pride, we've never had any Black people and we don't have any now. Well, the only problem with that is that in the beginning of the 19th century, so beginning of the 1800s, almost half the population of Buenos Aires was African or African descendant. And the key that gives it away is the national dance. The national dance of Argentina is called tango. Tango. Yeah, well, that's not a Spanish word. That word, that's a Bantu word, and it means different things in different Bantu languages. Party, to dance, to come together to do something very important, to share very important knowledge, for example. So there were never any Africans and there aren't any African diasporans, but they dance tango.
Right. And this is connected to what you just said, a question about, thank you for the program today. And can Dr. Walker suggest some communities to visit in South or Central America to learn and experience African diaspora communities? I'm sure the answer is yes.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, first of all, Brazil. Brazil is first of all, we in the United States, we have learned the sense of hegemony that the United States has. We're the center of the world. We're the most important. It's just not true. We are not the most numerous in the Americas. Most African descendants in the world outside of Africa are Brazilian. The first Black country in the world is Nigeria. The second one is Brazil. Brazil has more African descendants than most African countries. The government, according to the latest census, has acknowledged 57% of the population self-identifies as Black or brown. All that means African descendant. And if they had a one-drop rule, like we do, it would be the number would be much higher. One of the former presidents, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, said he had one foot in the kitchen. Now that's a Brazilian way of saying I had a grandmama, a great grandmama of African origin. They either say one foot in the kitchen or one foot in the slave quarters. Yet he was white, according to Brazilian definitions. You can't do that and be white in the United States. But he was the president. He could say that and he could be the president. And it was probably true. It's so interesting to meet, particularly in Bahia, people who have importance in the society and who say, oh yeah, my grandmother, we all had an African grandmother, but I'm white. If I look like this, it's the sun. If I were in the United States, I'd be white. Right.
Yeah.
So
yeah, maybe some of the questions, responses to some of the questions will be on your website, but I want to go through them. And by the way, your films are on available to the public through the streaming service. Remind me, I'm just having a moment.
Quelly TV.
Quelly TV.
Yes. And why does Quelly TV? Quelly means truth in Swahili. Why does it exist? Because Dashuna Spencer was trying to find positive images of Black folks, Africans, people from the Caribbean, African descendants in the Americas on the other streaming services and could not. And so she decided to create a streaming service. And it's all films from Africa, the African diaspora, and positive images of us.
It's a wonderful, yes, it's a wonderful streaming service.
Yeah.
I highly recommend people subscribe to it.
Yeah.
And we're going over time, but if we have a few more minutes, I'll go through the questions and see how far we get.
Yeah. Here.
One person asked a recommended reading list on diaspora. That's a big question.
Well, I'd start with African Roots, American Cultures, Africa and the Creation of the Americas. Also, I lose my mind periodically. Once I went snow camping in Ely, Minnesota, the coldest place in the United States. I got my mind back though once I warmed up. But the most recent time I lost my mind was I organized a group. I got money when I was at Spelman. I got money from the United Negro College Fund to create a project between an HBCU and Afro-Latins. Now I have problems with that word Afro-Latins, Latin being a dead European language, but that's the word that folks use. So I could not do a project about them. I could do a project with them. So I asked a friend, Chucho Garcia, Jesus Garcia from Venezuela, who's a researcher, diplomat, and major organizer and a very talented person. I asked him to collaborate with me on this project. And so we, first of all, got together, wrote a proposal, got money, and came up with what was the major themes about the African diaspora. Spirituality, for example, resistance. In what ways did Africans resist? Africans and African descendants resisted all over the Americas. Every place. There's no place where you cannot find evidence of resistance. It's got to be researched, but it's there. And so we invited folks from all the Spanish-speaking countries in South America. We were going to invite Brazil, but they have too much. How are you going to talk about Brazil and Paraguay? Paraguay. So we excluded Brazil, and we just asked them to write about their cultures in the context of the nation. Now we're asking a bunch of folks who are community leaders, but who have not been to college. And they all said, but this was their only time to tell their story and to tell them their own story as protagonists. They all rose to the occasion. I helped a little bit, but we did a book called Conocimiento desde adentro, los afro-suramericanos hablan de sus pueblos y sus historias, knowledge from the inside. Afro-South Americans speak of their communities and their stories. And then it got translated into Portuguese by Kitabu Editora, Kitabu book in Swahili, an Afro-Brazilian publisher. And so we got together 4 times. I got some money from the Inter-American Foundation. And these folks who had not been researchers became researchers because they had the opportunity, the first time ever, to tell their stories. So I also recommend that book. I need to get it translated into English to make it more accessible, and I hope that's going to happen. We've been updating it because so much has happened in the last 10 years that it was really out of date, but it's updated now, and we just need someone to translate it into English.
Okay, that's
what to read. So those are 2 books. There's this new book, Born in Blackness. It's wonderful, and all these books have recommended readings, bibliographies. I just found one called it's called something like Europeans and Africans in Europe over the past 500 years, not just in the 20th century. And it's by a Cameroonian woman who is the first African historian to be, who's gotten some sort of major honor by the Organization of Historians in England. So now there's a lot to read. There's a great book called Undercurrents of Power that, supposedly we can't swim until Simone Manuel got gold in the Olympics and showed But this is about the first underwater divers in the Americas, Undercurrents of Power. They were from what was called colonially the Gold Coast and decolonially Ghana from the Empire of Ghana that was also a gold culture. So now there's so much. There's a book that I've been planning to read that's called something like Myths of Africa. And, it's like the myth.
Mhm.
Hey, you want to know the truth? So there's really a lot.
So I'm going to take a couple more questions. There's one that says, on the level of language in the diaspora, oral traditions, or written literatures, does your work address common narrative structuring, syntactical commonalities, distinct from Euro patterns? If not, could you suggest folks examining these aspects?
First of all, folks examining these aspects, Arthur Spears, African-American linguist and grammarian, not just, I'm interested in the culture of language, but he has come up with some really interesting stuff that we know without knowing what we know. My favorite example is what he calls the come of indignation, come as an auxiliary verb. And he said he was in his aunt's beauty salon one day and he, listening to the conversations. And one woman said, she come going over his house. And he thought, you can't say come, go. They're both verbs of movement in different directions. Of course, he knew what she was saying. Had the heifer had the nerve. So Arthur Spears, has discovered more of such expressions. And he also is a Creolist, right? So he is aware of various and speaks Spanish, Portuguese, the usual French. So he's aware of those kind of connections. I am not all that, but the habitual be, we be partying. Okay, we be partying now. What y'all do on Saturdays? We be partying. So it's both something in the present, a gerund, and it's a habitual behavior. Well, it seems to me that in Martinique and Creole, of which I know a little bit, let's say, nous café la fête. What are you doing now? We're partying. Nous café la fête. We all do on Saturdays. We be partying. So I think that's an example of that habitual be, and I suspect that it comes from the Bantu language family. So I wish I knew more about that. I think that's really key to our understanding the African diaspora, the commonalities, linguistics. I was in Panama, and an Afro-Panamanian said, "Tengo cabanga," and I'd never heard that word before, cabanga. But I knew what it was because I'd heard it in Bahia. There's a place called Café do Banzo, ter banzo. Banzo is nostalgia. And cabanga is nostalgia. And it both apparently, and those are not European words, okay? The nostalgia was for Africa, for home. There's a term in French, bamboula. In French, it's an insult for Black folks. But there's a great article written by a Congo, so from the Bakongo people, who's also a Congolese citizen of the Republic of Congo. And it's about Africans dancing in Congo Square in Louisiana. And he said that, in French, to faire la bamboula is it's disorder, to create disorder. That's often how European languages treat African words. But the Congos who were dancing in Congo Square and using that term were saying, we are dancing to remember. So Bambula refers to ancestors whom one is recalling in one's bodily motions. And what the author, Honoré Mobonda, says is these folks were colonizing cultural space in the Americas by dancing to remember and to recall their ancestors. And if you'll notice, throughout the Americas, we dance. And initially I thought, the stereotype is true, but the stereotype suggests triviality of dancing. In Lydia Cabrera's book about Santeria, she says, she quotes a conversation among a nice Catholic woman and a woman who believes in, serves the Orishas. And the Afro-Cuban woman says, you know, it's fine if your spiritual beings are content with prayers. Ours want to dance.
And it's also a means to liberation. That's my take on it, and
Yeah,
and to freeing ourselves. As when we did this program, I knew there'd be a lot of chat, and entries in the chat, and people with their opinions. So I advise people to go and look at them. But I want to end with one more question. In the near or distant future, we begin to see the inquiry of Africans in diaspora more interested in returning to the continent. How can a healthy dialogue around coexistence begin between diasporans and folks from the continent? I actually work at a local organization called the Priority Africa Network, and we have African Diaspora Dialogues. That's one thing that people can do. But I'm curious about your response.
Well, Africans have been colonized and we have been colonized. So other people have told us our stories and told us about each other. I think that we, particularly we from the Americas, need to make more of an effort to know Africa for ourselves, because that's how we know who we are. Alain Locke said there is nothing more galvanizing than a knowledge of one's historical past. So if we don't know our story, then we don't know who we are. We don't know what we've contributed. Therefore, we don't know what we merit. And we don't know what we have in common with Africans. We've been fed all kinds of stereotypes, right? Africans as primitive. No, that's just not true. And Born in Blackness makes a great point of that. The richest man in the world was Mansa Musa, who took 60,000 people, or maybe only 20,000. That's a lot of people. He wanted to go to Mecca, so they had to walk from the Mali Empire across Africa to Egypt, to the Mecca. He spent so much gold during that trip because Mali was a gold culture that he upset the value of gold in the world for decades. Well, why don't we want to know that? Why don't I want to know that that's who I come from? Those are my people. We have been taught that Africans are primitive, so when they come to the Americas, we don't want to like them. Or now we're told, well, they have privileges that we don't have. Well, maybe that is true, but we need to get to know each other. And we need to see commonalities. When I went to Cameroon, I was 19, lived with a family, and my most traumatic moments were meal times because I didn't know what they were going to give me to eat. And, eating is important, and you got to do that several times a day. And so initially, my Cameroonian mother was really tactful about all this. So we started with, string beans and broiled chicken, French fries, things that I knew and thought, this is good. The chickens were certainly better than ours because they're real chickens, they ate real chicken food in nature. But then one day, everything changed. We had this big lump of white stuff and some greens with some meat in them. And I thought, and I tasted it and I hated it. But I had to eat it because I was living with these people. Then, after hating it for not too long, I began to understand that big ball of white stuff made out of corn was not so different from grits, okay? And those greens with that meat in them, they were different greens. There are a lot of greens on the planet. These were different from the ones I knew, but they were actually kind of similar to collard greens, kale, mustard greens, turnip greens. So I got a sense of the commonalities. For New Year's Eve, I made the black eyed peas, of course, but I made some as I'd had them in Ghana. I put a little palm oil in my black eyed peas, red, delicious. So we, for our own mental health, need to know more about Africans. We need to be more welcoming to Africans. We are not. There's a documentary that's on my website called Black Washington. So an African, a Cameroonian, came to film. I think his intention was mainly Africans in Washington, but he also wanted to know the interaction between Africans and us, African Americans. And he, and so I think I'm the only African American, and I talk about, my wonderful experiences in Africa, the commonalities and all that. But the Africans are of two generations, and the older generation has integrated with African Americans, and we're all fine. The younger generation expects to be welcomed, is not welcomed by us, and then then they don't like us either. And I thought, wait, what's going on? What is this problem? But we're the hosts, we're the ones who live here. We need to learn more about ourselves from them. So we should be a little more open to learning about us and to seeing all of us as us. That doesn't mean we're mad at anybody.
Right. Well, that's great. I mean, the words that I embrace, I think they're words of wisdom, and they can, use to guide us in our relationships.
Yeah.
They're necessary.
I think so. And let me just say, as a result of my travels throughout, I haven't been every place in Africa. I must have maybe 15 more countries of the over 50 countries. I'm missing 2 in the Americas, El Salvador and Guyana, but I've been every place else. And I've been to Turkey, visit the Afro-Turks, 3 groups in India. There's still more of the world for me to get to know. But as a result of the way I've been welcomed in all these places, like in India, I was visiting some Afro-Indians, and they're looking at me and saying, oh, she said she was American. She's one of us. They saw Obama as an American Sindhi, Afro-Indian. So now, as a result of all this, and as a result of understanding that African families and ethnic groups were broken up and scattered through the Americas by enslavers, my identity is that I am from the global African diaspora with a US passport as a result of the slave ship. I'm not I'm not mad about it. It's a convenient identity, a convenient passport. But when I go to Brazil, nobody just looks at me and says, oh, she must be from the United States. No, they hear my Portuguese and they say, well, she talks funny. What part of Brazil are you from? So I like being a citizen of the global African diaspora.
Well, I thank one of the people commenting, Allison, who says, MoAD should have Dr. Walker provide an African diaspora course online. She's a wealth of knowledge. Great program.
Thank you.
But I think that's a great way to end. And I want you to say again the address of your website.
Okay, and it will probably grow. It's https:// Afro Diaspora Global. That's the important part. AfroDiasporaGlobal.com, and the YouTube channel that's behind it is Afro Diaspora Global, 2 words, Sheila S. Walker, and both of them, both the YouTube channel and the website, will grow because I keep doing more diasporic stuff that I need to share. Right now, I'm editing a film that one of these, online. With Afro-Chileans. And I think everybody doesn't know they exist, but I'm going to have to put it on the website so that people can say, Afro-Chileans? Yep.
and I won't let you go before you say that your archive is, your work is being archived in the Black Feminist Archive at the University of Massachusetts?
Yes. There is a new archive being created by Dr. Irma McLaurin, an anthropologist, and it's called the Black Feminist Archive, and it's part of the University of Massachusetts Social Change University Archive, located in the W.E.B. Du Bois Library, tallest building on the campus. And so it's the point that Dr. McLaurin is making is that African-American women have not been, she says, seen or heard. Now we're getting seen and heard a lot more lately, but what if you want to know the story of African American women? Where do you find that information? And so this Black Feminist Archive is going to be a repository of the papers, and in my case, the visual stuff of an increasingly large group of Black women. And it's not just African American. One of the some of the information that was recently received was from a woman from Belize. So it's not geographically limited. And so I just took boxes and boxes and boxes of print, you know, my institutional life at all those institutions, with evidence of the fights, the battles, those people who didn't want me to go where I had to go to find out what I needed to find out about Africa and the African diaspora so I could share it. That's in there. And I think it's not, you will find that probably not only with me, but with other Black women too. So I'm really thrilled that, you know, papers that what would I have done with such papers? Well, now they will be useful for people who want to know about us. And so now I'm looking at those papers, not anymore as clutter in my study, but as archival materials from which people can learn about those of us who have paved certain paths. So it's an exciting moment.
Certainly, and this has been an exciting conversation. Thank you so much. It's been really rich, and I hate to say to end this, but we probably have to, but maybe we'll be back. The idea of you doing a course with MoAD would be great.
Interesting, yeah.
Yeah, well, we will definitely.
Thank you so much.
We'll definitely have to discuss that, Dr. Walker. And thank you so much for this wonderful program. Thank you, Cornelius, for your conversation and questions, and for everything that we all learned today. It's been really magnificent. So I do want to mention that our next African Diaspora Film Club will meet on Sunday, June 5th at 5 p.m. Pacific. We'll be back to our regular Sunday, 5 p.m. time, although not the second Sunday, the first Sunday. And we'll be discussing the documentary When Claude Got Shot with the subject of the film, Claude Motley, as well as the director, Brad Lichtenstein, and producer Santana Coleman joining us for the conversation. And you can learn more and register for this program on MoAD's website. I also put it in the chat. If you're in the Bay Area, MoAD is open to the public. We have 4 beautiful exhibitions on view right now, including the one that you can see behind me on my background. And we would really appreciate it if you would take a moment to fill out the online survey that I put in the chat as well. It only takes a few minutes, and we are incentivizing it by holding a raffle every month. So if you fill it out, we'll draw a name every month, and you can win a $25 gift certificate for our bookstore at MoAD. I also want to thank Black Public Media for partnering with us and supporting this program and this program series. And special thanks to our partner, the Ethnicity, Race, and Indigenous Peoples section of the Latin American Studies Association, for co-presenting today's program. Thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Can I say one thing?
Yeah.
Don't get scared by the title When Claude Got Shot. Yes, please join us and watch the film. Actually, I think it's going to be on PBS this week. So.
Yeah, starting on May 9th.
Yeah, great.
All right, thank you all.
Thank you so much, Sheila.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time and your brilliance, Dr. Walker.
Thank you.
Okay, bye, everybody.